Story number 1.
The office was nearly silent, save for the occasional hum of the air conditioning and the distant tapping of my fingers against the keyboard. It was almost midnight, and I was the only one left in the building, finishing up some overdue reports. My company, a small logistics firm, occupied the 10th floor of a mostly empty high-rise. During the day, the open floor plan bustled with conversation and ringing phones. But at night, the space took on a different character. Shadows stretched across the walls, the flickering fluorescent lights cast odd shapes, and the creaks and groans of the old building seemed more pronounced. I had worked plenty of late nights before, but something about this one felt off. The unease settled in my stomach, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. I had promised myself that after I submitted these last few reports, I'd pack up and leave. The clock on my monitor read 12:03 a.m. when I first heard it. A faint sound. A whisper. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It was soft, like someone murmuring just outside my cubicle. Slowly, I turned my head and scanned the office. The rows of desks were empty. The break room light was off. I told myself it was nothing, just my tired brain playing tricks. I resumed typing, but my mind was alert now, every sound amplified. Then a chair scraped against the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. It came from the far side of the office, near the conference room. I stood up, my chair rolling back slightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. No answer. I took hesitant steps toward the sound, my breathing shallow. The conference room's glass walls were dark, reflecting only the dim office lights. I flicked the switch and the room flooded with brightness. Empty. A deep chill settled over me, making the hairs on my arms rise. Maybe it was just the AC shifting something. At least that's what I wanted to believe. I turned off the lights and hurried back to my desk, suddenly eager to finish up and leave. As I settled into my chair, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. A figure, standing just beyond the cubicles. I whipped my head in that direction, my pulse hammering. Nothing. I was done. I didn't care about the reports anymore. I saved my work, shut down my computer, and grabbed my bag. The sooner I got out, the better. As I walked toward the elevators, I sent a quick text to my coworker, Jason. "I swear I'm losing my mind. Thought I saw someone in the office just now." The elevator doors slid open with a ding, and I stepped inside, pressing the ground floor button. Just as the doors began to close, my phone buzzed. Jason's reply, "Dude, was it a woman?" Confused, I replied, "I didn't really see. Why?" A long pause. The elevator was descending slowly, each floor creeping by. My phone buzzed again. A couple of us have seen her, a woman in white, usually near the conference room. Thought it was a joke until Aaron swore she whispered his name last week. The air in the elevator suddenly felt thick. My stomach turned cold. Then the elevator stopped. Not at the lobby. The screen above the doors read 2. The basement. The doors slid open to darkness. I hadn't pressed this floor. My breath hitched as a wave of icy air drifted in. The garage was supposed to be empty at this hour. I stabbed the closed door button frantically. Then, just before the doors sealed shut, I heard it. A soft whisper. Close. Too close. The elevator began to rise, but my whole body was shaking. When the doors finally opened to the lobby, I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the cool night air. My phone buzzed one last time. Jason again. "She always disappears when you look directly at her. Just don't stay late alone again." I never did. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was my first week working the night shift at the old office building, and the routine had already begun to settle in. The company I worked for had recently moved into this building, which had been vacant for a few years. The floors were large with a lot of empty space, and the whole place had a cold, clinical feel. The lights were always on, but there was a persistent dullness in the air, a sense that the building was never truly alive. I worked as an IT technician, mostly tasked with fixing computers and maintaining the network. On the night shift, there were usually no other staff members around. The night was long and quiet, with only the sound of my fingers tapping on the keyboard, the occasional hum of a machine, and the low buzz of fluorescent lights above. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I didn't mind the solitude. The office was located on the 3rd floor of the building, and from there, I had a clear view of the empty hallways. My desk was positioned in front of a large window that looked out onto the other side of the floor, where the main corridor stretched off into the distance. Most of the rooms on the third floor were empty or used for storage, and the whole floor felt like a maze of forgotten spaces. I was used to being alone at work. I'd done it before at other jobs, and it didn't bother me. But on that particular night, something was different. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed it. The building had been silent, like it always was, except for the faint echo of my movements. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing some system updates on my computer, when I heard a sound from the hallway. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. I paused, listening carefully, my heart rate picking up a little. There was no one else in the building, as far as I knew. The sound didn't seem like it was coming from anywhere specific, just an ambient noise that seemed to float in the air. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the building's creaky old plumbing or the hum of the HVAC system. I had gotten used to these little quirks over the past few days, so I went back to work. But then the noise came again. This time it was clearer, a distinct, quiet scraping sound. I frowned, setting my cup of coffee down on the desk. What was that? I muttered to myself, getting up from my chair and walking toward the hallway. The office lights flickered for a second, and I paused, uncertain if it was just the usual electrical glitch or something more. I stepped into the hallway, peering around the corner, but the corridor was empty. No one was there. There was only the low, buzzing hum of the overhead lights. I glanced at the storage room down the hall, but the door was shut tight. The scraping sound had definitely seemed to come from that direction. For a moment, I felt a chill run through me, but I told myself it was just nerves. The building was old, and sounds like that were common. I returned to my desk, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. The noise had stopped, and everything seemed still again. But just as I sat down, I noticed something strange. The lights in the hallway flickered again, but this time they flickered twice, once on, then off, then back on. I stood up again, this time with more purpose. This is ridiculous, I muttered to myself. The place was just old and needed maintenance. I walked toward the hallway and stopped at the end of it, near the storage room. My breath caught in my throat. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar now. I could see a thin sliver of darkness beyond the doorway. I felt an uneasy knot twist in my stomach. I hadn't left the door open. In fact, I was sure it had been shut tight when I passed by earlier. My heart started pounding in my chest, and a sense of dread washed over me. It wasn't just the door being open, it was the feeling of being watched, the subtle change in the air, like something had shifted. Get a grip, I told myself. It's just the building settling, nothing more. But despite my own reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked toward the door slowly and nudged it open further. The storage room was pitch dark, the dim light from the hallway barely reaching inside. I could just make out rows of old filing cabinets and forgotten office equipment stacked on shelves. But there was something else. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it more clearly. A shape, crouching in the corner. It was difficult to make out, but I could swear I saw something dark and hunched, something that shouldn't have been there. I froze, my blood running cold. My instincts told me to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. It was almost like I couldn't move, as if the air itself had become thick and heavy. The figure shifted in the corner, and I heard a faint rasping sound, like someone breathing heavily or something moving in the dark. Hello? My voice barely came out above a whisper, and I immediately regretted it. There was no answer, just the eerie silence. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart in my throat. As I crossed the threshold into the room, the air grew colder, almost freezing. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me to get closer. A wave of panic hit me, but I forced myself to keep moving. I reached out with shaking hands and flipped the light switch. The room flooded with harsh, bright light. Nothing. The room was empty. The filing cabinets stood quietly in their place, the shelves stacked with old boxes. There was no sign of the figure I had seen, no movement, nothing to explain what I had just witnessed. My pulse hammered in my chest as I scanned the room, but there was no one there. I turned and hurried out of the storage room, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing. trying to come up with some logical explanation for what I had just seen. Maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. After all, I'd been staring at a computer screen for hours. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong. The building was old, yes, but there was more to it than that. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I made my way back to my desk, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. I didn't want to stay in the building any longer. My shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m., but I couldn't bring myself to continue working. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling that same unsettling presence lingering, as though it was still watching me. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I spent the last few hours at night constantly looking around, half expecting the figure to return. The noises stopped, but the air felt thick and suffocating, like something was just beyond my reach, waiting. When the sun finally began to rise, I quickly packed up my things and left the office, my heart still pounding. I didn't look back. I haven't worked the night shift alone there since. There are times when I can still feel that cold, oppressive air and hear that faint, rasping sound in my ears. And I wonder if it was just my imagination, or if something really was waiting for me in that storage room. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
I never believed in ghosts, or at least I didn't think I did. I had always dismissed stories about haunted buildings or strange occurrences as figments of overactive imaginations. But that all changed during my time working the night shift alone at the old factory where I was employed. I was a night security guard at a long-abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of town. The place had been repurposed into a storage warehouse after the factory closed its doors decades ago. It was large, eerie, and mostly empty. A few small businesses rented out parts of the building, but the rest of the complex was filled with old machinery, dusty offices, and forgotten rooms. The only people around during the night were the occasional truck drivers delivering or picking up goods. My shift started at 11 p.m. and lasted until 7 a.m. It was a quiet job, mostly sitting at the security desk, monitoring the surveillance cameras, walking the long halls, and making sure everything was secure. At first, the silence of the place didn't bother me. It was just part of the job, and I took comfort in knowing that nothing ever really happened. But there was something about this place, something that seemed to weigh heavily in the air. It wasn't just the silence. It was the stillness, the strange way the shadows crept in the corners of my vision, and the faint sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, about 2 months into my job, I began my shift like any other. The building was dark, cold, and the usual hum of the lights above was the only noise accompanying my footsteps. I passed by the offices, making sure the windows were locked and the doors were secure. Everything was normal until I reached the back of the warehouse where the storage areas were located. There, the place felt different. The cold seemed sharper, more oppressive. The usual hum of the air conditioning was replaced by a low creaking sound, almost like the building itself was groaning under its own weight. It didn't take long before I started to feel watched. I couldn't explain it, but as I stood in the middle of the warehouse, something in the air changed. The temperature dropped and I felt a chill run down my spine. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the draft from the open spaces. But as I continued my rounds, the unease only grew. The sounds that had once been faint whispers now seemed closer, like footsteps behind me, just out of sight. Sometimes, when I passed through one of the corridors, I would glance quickly to the side and see a shadow moving just out of view. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, so I ignored it and kept walking. That night, everything changed. It was just past 3 a.m., and I was sitting at the security desk, staring at the screens in front of me. The building was still, and I could hear the faintest echo of the wind howling outside. I had just taken a sip of coffee when I heard a loud bang from one of the storage rooms. I jumped in my chair, spilling coffee onto the desk. My heart raced as I quickly checked the security monitors, but there was nothing unusual. No one was moving, no trucks were in the lot, and no doors were open. The building was as empty as it had been when I arrived. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. It was probably just a door slamming in the wind or something falling over, but the noise had been too loud to ignore. My footsteps echoed in the vast space as I made my way down the narrow hallway toward the storage rooms. The faint sounds of something dragging against the floor came from up ahead, and I felt my stomach tighten. It sounded like someone was walking slowly, dragging something heavy behind them. I hesitated, then pushed forward, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room at the end of the hall was shrouded in shadow, and I couldn't make out what was inside. I took a step forward, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The dragging noise stopped suddenly, and an icy draft seemed to rush toward me from the open doorway. I paused, not sure if I should investigate further. But the urge to know what was happening pushed me forward. I reached for the door and swung it open. The room was empty, completely empty, except for an old desk, some crates, and a few dusty machines. Nothing out of place. No dragging noise, no movement. The air was still, but cold enough to send a shiver down my spine. I scanned the room once more, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves. But then, I saw it. A figure, just behind one of the large machines. I caught a glimpse of something. A shadow that didn't belong. It wasn't a person. It didn't move like a person. It was darker than the surrounding darkness, and it was watching me. I froze. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The air was thick, almost suffocating. My pulse raced as I tried to focus on the figure. But it was gone. I turned quickly, the flashlight beam darting in all directions, but there was no one there. I stepped forward, the sound of my footsteps deafening in the silence. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, and saw nothing but a solid wall of metal. No door, no handle. I was trapped in the room. I frantically searched the walls, trying to find some way to escape, but everything was locked. The room felt like it was pressing in on me. The shadows seemed to move on their own, curling and twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. I grabbed my radio and tried to call for help, but the signal was dead. The static buzzed in my ear, but no one responded. I felt the temperature drop even more, and I knew, deep down, that I was not alone. A voice, soft and raspy, filled the room. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. "Get out." I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and saw nothing but the same dark, empty room. The voice was gone, but the air was heavy now, almost suffocating. I had to leave. I didn't care about the building's security. I didn't care about anything but getting out. I finally managed to break the door open, but as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy, dragging. I ran. I ran without looking back, my footsteps echoing loudly in the hall as I made my way to the exit. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, and the lights flickered as I ran past them. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The night air hit me like a wave, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe again. I stood there, staring at the building, unable to shake the feeling that something was still inside watching from the windows. The next morning, I returned to work, but I could never shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that building. The noises, the shadows, the cold, something was there, and I knew that I had barely escaped. I don't work the night shift anymore. I couldn't.
Story number 4.
It was a typical Thursday evening when Claire started her night shift at the office. She'd been working here for almost 2 years now, managing accounts for a local insurance company, and the late hours had become a familiar routine. The building was large, with high ceilings and wide hallways, but after hours it felt empty, almost deserted. Most of her colleagues worked the 9 to 5 shift, so it was always just her on the top floor once the office lights dimmed and everyone else went home. Claire didn't mind. The quiet gave her the space to concentrate, to focus. But tonight, something felt different. The first sign of unease came just after 11 p.m. Claire had finished her usual tasks, returning emails, reviewing documents, and had settled in for a bit of light reading on her phone when she heard a soft sound coming from the hallway. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, like someone dragging their feet across the carpet. Claire paused. It was strange. She hadn't heard anyone come in. The janitors had already cleaned the main floor, and her colleagues had all left hours ago. She figured it was just her imagination playing tricks, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the building. She stood up and peered out of her cubicle. The hallway was empty. Shaking her head, she returned to her desk and tried to get back to her phone, but the unease lingered. She dismissed it as a result of too many late nights. But just as she started to settle back in, the sound came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate dragging noise, unmistakable and close. Her pulse quickened. She stood again, this time more cautiously, and walked toward the door. The hallway stretched out before her, bathed in the cold light from the emergency exit signs, but there was no one in sight. The noise had stopped. Claire felt a chill, but she pushed it aside. She was alone in the building. She always was at night. The sensation was probably just a result of the silence, she told herself, or maybe it was the HVAC system acting up. She glanced at the clock, 11:30 p.m. Halfway through her shift, still another 4 hours to go. She sat back down, determined to ignore the strange feeling crawling up her spine, but the dragging noise wouldn't leave her mind. She tried to distract herself with work, but it was as if the sounds were following her thoughts, growing louder with each passing minute. Then the unmistakable noise of footsteps. Someone was walking down the hallway. Claire's heart raced, and she gripped the edge of her desk. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like the person was trying to avoid detection. She swallowed hard and got up, stepping cautiously into the hallway. This time, she couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. It seemed to echo off the walls from every direction. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the empty space. No answer. No movement. Nothing. The hair on the back of her neck prickled. She looked down the long hallway to the stairwell and the restrooms, but there was no one. The building was still. A wave of nausea hit her stomach. There was something in the air tonight, something that didn't sit right. The silence was too thick, too heavy. She felt eyes on her, even though she was certain she was alone. It was like the building itself was watching her, waiting for something. The footsteps began again, only this time they were closer. Claire froze, her blood running cold. The sound was coming from just around the corner, from the break room, where no one should have been. She didn't move. Her breath caught in her throat as she waited, listening, heart pounding in her chest. A shadow moved across the break room door. She saw it from the corner of her eye, the silhouette of a figure. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stepped back, the door handle pressing against her palm. She needed to get out of here. This couldn't be real. She wasn't alone, and that thought terrified her. The door creaked open slowly. Claire's mind raced, but her body remained still, frozen in place. It was impossible to make sense of what she was seeing. The door had opened on its own, just a crack, and behind it, a figure stood, half hidden in the darkness. She was certain she saw someone, a tall figure standing in the shadows. But the moment her eyes adjusted, the figure seemed to flicker, its shape warping like a mirage in the dim light. "Who's there?" Claire called out again, her voice cracking slightly. There was no answer. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, silent and still, as though it was waiting for her, waiting for something. Claire felt a cold chill creeping up her spine. The air in the hallway had turned colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, like a freezer door had been opened somewhere. A feeling of dread settled in her chest. The footsteps began again, louder this time, and Claire's feet moved before her brain could catch up. She turned on her heel and fled down the hallway, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that it almost drowned out the footsteps that followed her. The elevator doors were in front of her now, and she frantically pressed the button, her fingers shaking. The overhead lights flickered, and for a split second, she thought she saw something in the corner of her eye, something moving. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened. She stepped inside without a second thought and pressed the button for the ground floor, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was alone. She was going home. But the elevator didn't move. The doors stayed open. The numbers on the panel blinked, frozen on the 12th floor. She pressed the button again, harder this time. Still nothing. Claire's pulse quickened. She turned to look out the door, half expecting to see something or someone standing just outside the elevator. But there was nothing, only the dim, empty hallway. Her hand hovered over the button once more, and just as she was about to press it again, the doors slammed shut with a force that made her flinch. The elevator lurched. Her stomach dropped as it began to move, slowly at first, then faster. She watched the floor numbers tick down, 12, 11, 10. But before it reached the ground floor, the elevator stopped with a jolt. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped further until she could see her breath in the air, and then she heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, just like before, and they were right outside the elevator door. Claire's heart nearly stopped as she pressed herself into the corner of the elevator, her eyes wide, straining to see through the gap between the doors. The footsteps were right outside, and then the elevator doors opened. But there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty hallway. Claire didn't wait. She ran the rest of the way to the stairwell, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't care who or what was in the building. She just needed to get out. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her legs aching, her lungs burning. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she reached the ground floor. She grabbed her bag, bolted through the lobby, and burst out into the night air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her hands were shaking as she started the engine, and she didn't look back once. Claire never returned to that building. She couldn't explain what had happened that night, but the images, the sound of those footsteps, the flickering shadows, haunted her. No matter how hard she tried, she could never forget. She had been alone at work, but she wasn't alone anymore. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was 11:30 p.m. when Ella walked into the office building. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the empty hallway, a sound that once used to soothe her nerves, but tonight only made her feel more isolated. She was used to working the night shift. Her job in customer service required it. But tonight was different. Tonight, something felt off. As she passed the rows of empty desks, she couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the quiet, making her jump at every turn. Her manager, Karen, had left hours ago. The building was always empty at night, aside from a few late-night cleaners, but they never came up to the upper floors. Tonight, there was no cleaning crew, and the silence seemed unnerving. Ella settled into her cubicle, the glow of her computer screen her only companion. She started typing emails, doing the usual tasks that would fill the hours until dawn. She had already turned the volume up on her playlist to drown out the eerie quiet when she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the hallway. It was rhythmic, like fingernails scraping against the wall, but when she stood up and peeked out of her cubicle, she saw nothing. The hallway was empty. She shrugged it off as a trick of her mind and returned to her work. But then, as if in reply, the sound came again. Louder this time, closer. Her heart began to race. She looked around nervously, the silence now pressing in on her. Another noise. This time it was a soft knock at the window behind her. Ella spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The blinds were drawn, and she could see nothing but her own reflection staring back at her, eyes wide with fear. She turned back to the screen, her fingers trembling as she typed, trying to focus, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread crawling over her skin. Minutes later, the phone rang. The shrill sound made her jump in her seat. She reached for it, still feeling the strange heaviness in the air, and picked up the receiver. No one spoke, just silence. She swallowed hard, her palms sweaty, and waited for a voice. But there was only the faintest of breathing on the other end. Then the call cut off. Ella placed the receiver down, trying to steady her breath. She stood up again, this time with more purpose. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone had gotten stuck in the building. She checked the hallway again, only to find it still empty, but the air felt colder now. The scratching sound, the soft knocking, something was not right. Just as she turned back to her desk, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. She whipped around, her heart pounding, but again, nothing was there. She walked over to the other side of the office, checking every corner, every door. The building was as quiet as it ever had been. Yet, the unease in her gut only grew stronger. Then, the lights flickered. Ella froze. The lights above her flickered once more, casting a strange shadow across the floor. She reached for her phone to call security, but before she could press the numbers, the lights went out completely. The darkness enveloped her in an instant, and her breath caught in her throat. The silence was now deafening, thicker than it had been before, and it pressed in on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She jumped and pulled it out quickly, almost desperate for a distraction. It was a message from Karen. "Everything okay up there? Just checking in." Ella's fingers trembled as she typed back a quick reply. The lights went out. I'm a little freaked out, but it's fine. Her words didn't seem convincing, even to herself. As she waited for Karen's response, a low creak sounded above her, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy. They echoed across the floor, getting closer. Ella's breath caught in her throat again, her body frozen. The footsteps weren't just random, they were deliberate. Her mind raced. Was someone playing a prank on her? Was it possible someone had gotten in? She turned to face the hallway, though she couldn't see a thing in the complete darkness. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she stood rooted to the spot, too terrified to move. The footsteps grew louder. Her heart was pounding in her ears now, and just as she was about to grab her things and flee, the lights flickered back on. For a brief moment, everything was illuminated, everything except the hallway. The hallway was pitch black, as though the darkness itself was refusing to leave. And then, just as quickly as the lights had come on, they went out again. In the darkness, Ella could hear the footsteps more clearly. They were right outside her cubicle now, the sound of shoes on tile unmistakable. She wanted to scream, to call out, but her voice was stuck in her throat. The air had turned cold again, biting at her skin. Then the footsteps stopped. A chill ran down her spine. She had no idea what to do. She couldn't move. The office was silent again, but this silence felt different. It felt alive, like something was watching her. And then she heard a whisper. Ella. Her name. It was clear, soft, and malevolent. It came from the darkness. Her stomach dropped and she instinctively backed away, bumping into her desk in her panic. Ella. The whisper came again, closer this time. Ella felt a cold breath on her neck and she spun around to face it, but there was nothing there. The air was thick with dread, and for the first time in her life, she felt something that made her blood run cold. Pure terror. Suddenly, the lights came back on. She looked around, her hands trembling, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. The office looked the same. Everything was in its place, nothing out of the ordinary. But the air, the atmosphere, felt different. Heavier. The silence was louder than ever. She dared to breathe, slowly, deeply, trying to calm her nerves. Maybe it had all been a trick of her imagination. The fear and the loneliness of the night had gotten to her. Just as she thought she might be able to regain control, the door to the stairwell swung open. A figure stood there, dark, tall, and with something about the way it stood that sent another wave of cold terror crashing over her. It didn't move at first, just stood there, watching her. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Ella could feel its gaze like a weight on her chest. The air grew even colder, if that was possible. Ella didn't know how, but she knew that whatever it wasn't human. Without thinking, she grabbed her bag and bolted for the exit. She didn't care about anything else, just the overwhelming urge to escape. She didn't hear the footsteps anymore, but she didn't dare stop. Her mind raced as she fumbled for her keys, and as she reached the door to the outside, the figure's voice echoed in her ears, too clear now. Stay with me, Ella. She slammed the door behind her, breathing hard. The night air hit her like a slap to the face, but it didn't calm the terror that gripped her. Her body was shaking, her heart racing in her chest, and she could still feel the presence of the figure lingering, even though she was outside. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, her hands fumbling to unlock it. When she finally did, she threw herself inside and slammed the door shut. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it with a shaking hand, hoping it was Karen, hoping for some sense of normalcy. But the message was different this time. The number wasn't Karen's. The message simply read, "I'm still here." Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was a cold, rainy Thursday night when Sarah started her night shift at the small law firm on the outskirts of town. The office was in an old brick building with squeaky floors and tall windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. It wasn't a place that spooked her. She had been working there for over a year, and the solitude of the late shift suited her. She was the only one in the building most nights, with just a few cleaning staff that came and went. But they were typically finished by 11 p.m., leaving her alone in the silence. Sarah had always been a night owl, so the late hours didn't bother her. The quiet, the lack of distractions made her more productive. The glow of the fluorescent lights, the hum of the computer, and the sound of her own typing were the only sounds in the otherwise still office. She settled into her chair, pushing her coffee cup aside, and got to work. The clock on the wall ticked away, the only indication of time moving. The night started like any other, calm and uneventful. She went through her tasks, reading over case files, making a few calls, and updating client information. The rain outside pelted the windows with a steady rhythm, and the occasional crack of thunder sent a shiver down her spine. But she dismissed it. It was just the weather. Around midnight, Sarah felt the first inkling of unease. She had been sitting at her desk when she heard a faint sound, a soft scraping like something was being dragged across the floor. It was distant, coming from somewhere deep in the building. Her first instinct was to shrug it off. The building was old, and sometimes the old pipes would creak and groan, settling into place. But this was different. It sounded deliberate. She stood up and walked to the hallway, peering into the dark stretch of the corridor that led to the storage room. The lights were dim, but everything seemed fine. No one was there. She felt a slight tension in her chest, but she dismissed it as overactive nerves. It had been a long day, and maybe she was just imagining things. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. She returned to her desk and continued working, though her mind kept returning to the strange noise. She was about to get back to work when she heard it again. This time, it was closer. The scraping sound followed by a faint thud as if something heavy had been dropped on the floor. Her pulse quickened. Sarah stood up again, her eyes scanning the hallway. She walked cautiously toward the storage room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She reached for the light switch and flicked it on, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent light. The room was empty, just rows of old files and boxes stacked on shelves. She exhaled a shaky breath, irritated with herself. "Get it together, Sarah," she muttered under her breath. It was probably just the old building settling. Still, she couldn't help but feel unsettled. The clock on the wall read 1:15 a.m. Sarah tried to push the odd feeling to the back of her mind, but the eerie atmosphere in the office was beginning to get to her. She had always considered herself a rational person, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or things that went bump in the night. But there was something about this place, something that made her question her sense of security. She returned to her desk and tried to focus on the work in front of her. But then she heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the echo of someone walking down the hallway. Her heart raced in her chest. This was no creaky pipe or settling floorboard. These were real footsteps, someone walking deliberately like they were coming toward her. Sarah stood up, her breath shallow. She walked toward the hallway, her footsteps quick and light. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, just the faint glow of emergency exit signs marking the dark corners of the office. Her heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't alone. But who else was here? The cleaning staff had all left hours ago, and there was no one else scheduled to work tonight. She made her way to the front door and checked to make sure it was locked. The building had several exits, but none of them were meant to be used by employees after hours. The front door was secure, and the windows were all shut tight. As she turned back toward the hallway, she heard the sound again. This time, it was unmistakable, right behind her. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway toward her. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her breathing was shallow now. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, pulling it from her pocket to call security. But just as she began to dial, the office lights flickered and went out, plunging the entire room into darkness. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She fumbled with her phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but before she could, she heard the sound of someone breathing. It was close. Too close. Her heart raced as she spun around, her eyes frantically scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The flashlight on her phone flickered to life, and she shone it down the hallway. Nothing. Just the shadows, the emptiness. The air felt heavy, thick, as though something was pressing in on her. The breathing, soft, labored, almost as if it were coming from someone who was struggling, was louder now, just behind her. She froze, the blood draining from her face. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she jumped. It was a text from her friend, Mia, who had texted her about a new episode of their favorite show. Sarah quickly typed a response, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread gnawing at her. But then something caught her eye. In the reflection of the phone's screen, she saw it. A shadow, dark and long, moving slowly down the hallway toward her. Her breath hitched in her throat. The figure moved in fits and starts, like it was walking, then pausing, then walking again. It was faint at first, but as she stared at the reflection, the shadow grew larger, more defined. It wasn't a person, not exactly. The figure was tall and lanky, its outline blurry and indistinct. There was no face, just a silhouette that seemed to warp and shift in the reflection of the phone's screen. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't look away. Her entire body froze as the figure got closer. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the shadow disappeared in an instant. The air was still. The office was quiet again. No footsteps, no shadow, no breathing. But the feeling, the sensation of being watched, remained. Sarah didn't stick around to investigate further. She grabbed her things in a rush, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She bolted for the door and didn't stop running until she was outside, her feet splashing through the rain as she hurried to her car. She didn't care that she had left her coat behind. She didn't care about anything except getting away from the office. As she drove away, her hands still shaking on the steering wheel, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for her in that building. Something had been watching her, and it hadn't wanted her to leave. The next day, Sarah called in sick and never returned to the office again. She had no explanation for what had happened that night. No rational reason for the strange noises, the shadow, the feeling of being watched. But she knew what she had felt, and she never went back to that office again. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
I've worked night shifts before. I'm no stranger to the quiet hours spent alone in an office. It's almost calming, the solitude. But the night I'll never forget? That was a different story altogether. I was working at a mid-sized marketing firm in the city, located in an old office building, the kind that's seen better days, cracked tiles, flickering lights, and a faint smell of dust in the air. The work itself wasn't particularly exciting, but it was stable. My usual shift was from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., and the office was mostly empty by the time I arrived. My boss, Michelle, had left by 5, and the only others around were the occasional cleaning crew who'd come through around midnight. On this particular night, the weather was awful. It had been raining all day, and the wind was howling against the windows. By the time I arrived, the streets were nearly empty, the storm driving everyone indoors. As usual, the building was quiet when I stepped in, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the lobby. The elevator creaked as it took me up to the 5th floor, where the marketing department was located. I sat up at my desk, running through the motions, answering emails, checking the analytics dashboard, and reviewing client proposals. It's not glamorous work, but it kept me busy enough. At around 10:30 p.m., I got up to grab some coffee from the break room. The office kitchen was on the other side of the floor, and as I walked down the long hallway, the only sounds were my footsteps echoing against the tiled floor. The hallway was dimly lit, with a few bulbs buzzing here and there. I reached the break room and poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to ignore the loneliness that always crept in during these hours. As I was stirring in some sugar, I heard it. A soft... I froze, the spoon still in my hand. The noise had come from somewhere nearby, but I couldn't pinpoint where. It didn't sound like it came from the hallway, but from somewhere deeper in the office. My heart beat a little faster, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just the building settling. I tried to calm myself down and returned to my desk. The sound came again, this time louder, like something heavy being dropped. I stood up quickly, my pulse quickening. I knew I was alone. Michelle had left hours ago, and the cleaning staff wouldn't arrive for another hour. My eyes darted toward the hallway, but everything looked still. The glow from the emergency exit signs flickered dimly in the distance. The office was still. I sat back down, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the building's quirks. But then the noise came again, closer this time, a distinct thump followed by a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My stomach twisted. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sounds weren't normal, and there was no way it was just the building settling. I stood up and hesitated for a moment. I knew I shouldn't be paranoid, but something didn't sit right. Slowly, I walked out of my cubicle and into the hallway. The floor creaked under my feet as I moved forward, the sound of my own steps almost too loud in the silence. As I reached the corner, I heard another thud, followed by the scraping again. It came from the far end of the hallway, near the storage closet. I reached the storage room, and without thinking, I flung open the door. There was nothing there. No boxes knocked over, no spilled papers, no sign of anything that could have made the noise. I let out a breath, feeling silly. Maybe I was just overreacting. The storm outside had rattled the windows, and maybe the sound was just the wind or something from the old building. But as I turned to leave the storage room, I heard it again. This time it was closer, like someone was walking behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Nothing at all. I backed out of the storage room and made my way quickly back to my desk, my mind racing. I sat down and tried to focus on my work, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The thudding noises had stopped, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The silence in the office felt oppressive, like the air had thickened, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper. It wasn't long before I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth down the hallway. I stood up, gripping the edge of my desk, my breath shallow. I'd had enough. There was no reason for anyone to be here. There was no one else in the building. I grabbed my phone and called the security company, my fingers shaking. The receptionist picked up. "Hello, security. How can I assist you? I'm alone in the office and I keep hearing noises, footsteps, scraping. I trailed off, unsure of how to explain it. How could I explain the feeling of someone being here when I knew I was the only person on the floor? The receptionist sounded calm. "I understand, ma'am. I'll send someone up to check the building. Please stay on the line." I hung up without waiting for a response, my anxiety boiling over. I turned off my computer and grabbed my coat. The rain was pouring harder outside, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. As I stood up, I heard the noise again. This time, it was unmistakable. It was the sound of a door opening slowly, creaking on its hinges, followed by the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. I couldn't stay. I bolted for the elevator, my heart hammering in my chest, but as I approached it, I froze. The elevator doors were already open. I hadn't pressed the button. In fact, I hadn't even been near the elevator in hours. My hands trembled as I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I turned and ran down the hallway toward the stairwell, not caring if I got soaked in the rain. I needed to get out. I needed to get out of that building. But as I reached the stairwell door, I heard one last sound, the faintest whisper, a voice. Soft. Low. It said my name. Sarah. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I pushed open the door and ran down the stairs as fast as I could, my shoes slipping on the wet steps. When I finally made it to the lobby, I shoved open the front doors and rushed out into the pouring rain, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the wet streets, my hands still shaking. I didn't know what I had heard that night. Whether it was the wind, my imagination, or something else entirely. But I've never gone back to that office. The building is still there, but every time I drive past, I feel a cold shiver run down my spine. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The hospital was always quiet during the night shift. I was used to the eerie stillness that settled in around 11 p.m. when most of the patients were asleep and the bustling sounds of the day faded away. I'd worked as a janitor at St. Agnes Hospital for 3 years, and I had come find comfort in the rhythm of cleaning the empty hallways and empty rooms. I knew the building well. Every hallway, every dark corner, and every creaky floorboard. But one night, during my usual routine, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about that hospital. It was just after midnight, and the hospital felt emptier than usual. There was an old section of the building that hadn't been used in years, at least not for patient care. It was a small ward, long abandoned, with peeling paint on the walls and rust on the old medical equipment. For as long as I could remember, that part of the hospital had been off limits to everyone. The door to that wing was always locked, and I'd never had any reason to go in there. That night, I had finished mopping the main hallway and was making my way toward the supply closet near the old ward when I noticed something odd. The door to the abandoned wing was slightly ajar, just enough to see a sliver of the dark corridor beyond. I stopped, frowning. That door should have been locked. I knew it. In all my years working there, I had never seen it left open. My first thought was that someone might be playing a prank, but I didn't hear any voices or movement from inside. Only silence. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly approached the door. I peered inside, feeling a chill spread through me as I did. The corridor beyond was cloaked in darkness, but I could make out the outlines of the old rooms, their doors slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry. It was an unsettling sight. Just as I was about to turn away, I heard something. A soft rustling sound, as though something was being moved in the dark. My heart raced. I thought for a moment that it could be an animal or some debris from the old rooms, but there was something about the sound that didn't sit right with me. It was too deliberate, too human. I hesitated. I should have walked away, but my curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I stepped forward, peeking through the small crack in the door. The rustling stopped suddenly, and I felt a coldness crawl up my spine. The air in that hallway felt thick, unnatural, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. There was no response. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for some sign that someone was in there. But the silence was suffocating. I was just about to step away when I saw it. Movement. A figure, barely visible in the dark, shifted in one of the rooms farther down the hall. It wasn't a person, at least it didn't look like one. It was tall, too tall, and hunched over, as if it was trying to hide in the shadows. My pulse quickened and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I shouldn't have gone in there. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It slowly turned, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of its face, if it could even be called a face. There were no eyes, just empty sockets that seemed to stare into my very soul. The figure was wearing a hospital gown, but it was stained with dark patches like blood. I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me, almost as if the building itself was forcing me to leave. I was frozen, unable to move, and the terror that washed over me was like nothing I had ever felt before. For what felt like forever, I stood there trying to catch my breath. I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears, the sound of blood rushing through my body. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The door was now firmly shut. I didn't dare open it again. I turned and ran. I don't know how I managed to make it back to the main hall, but somehow I did. My legs felt like jelly and my hands shook uncontrollably as I grabbed my phone from my pocket, dialing the security office. The line rang several times before someone picked up. "Security," a tired voice said. "I need help," I stammered, my voice trembling. "There's someone in the old wing. I saw something. A figure." The security guard on the other end of the line was silent for a moment. "There's no one in the old wing," he said, his tone flat. "That part of the building is off limits. It's been sealed for years. No one's supposed to be there." "But I saw something," I insisted. "It was wearing a hospital gown, and it had no eyes. It was in the hallway. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw." There was a long pause. The guard didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was different, slower, more deliberate. "Listen, kid," he said quietly. "I've worked here for over a decade. I've heard stories about the old wing. You're not the first to see things. I don't know what it is, but it's been there for years. Some people say it's just figment of the mind, but others aren't so sure. Stay away from that hallway. Don't go near the old ward again." I hung up, my mind racing. What had I seen? Was it just a trick of the light? Or was there something more to the stories that I had heard from other workers, things that they never spoke about openly? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going near that part of the hospital again. The next morning, I spoke to a few of the nurses about the old wing, and to my surprise, one of them confirmed the stories. "It's been abandoned for years," she told me, "but sometimes strange things happen. Some of the staff swear they've seen things, figures moving in the hallways, lights flickering. We avoid it now, The hospital's old, and you never know what might be hiding in the dark. I never worked a night shift again. The thought of being alone in that hospital after hours with the old wing looming in the distance was too much. I left my job shortly after that night, and I've never returned to St. Agnes Hospital since. But every time I drive past it, I can't help but glance at the building, wondering if the figure still walks the halls in the darkness. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
I had been working night shifts at the hospital for about 6 months. It wasn't something I was thrilled about, but it was a job, and I needed the hours. The building was old, sprawling over several floors with long, empty corridors and rooms that seemed too large for the number of patients we had. Most nights, I was assigned to work the emergency department, handling patient intake, filling out paperwork, and making sure the hospital was running smoothly while everyone else got some rest. The atmosphere was usually quiet, save for the occasional emergency or medical team running through. But one particular night changed everything for me. It was a Thursday. The rain had been coming down in sheets, the kind of downpour that made the streets shimmer with reflection, and the only sounds in the hospital were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. By midnight, I was the only one left on the floor. The rest of the staff had either left or were off duty, and the only thing I had left to do was finish up some reports and make sure the emergency room was prepped for any new arrivals. I remember walking through the quiet hallways, checking rooms, making sure the doors were locked and the equipment was in place. The hospital had that sterile smell of antiseptic and metal, but tonight it felt different, almost suffocating. I wasn't sure what it was, but something about the place felt off. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the building groan. I chalked it up to the weather, which was probably making me more anxious than usual. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the nurse's station, typing up my last few notes for the night when I heard it. A faint noise from down the hall. I thought at first it was just the wind, or maybe a nurse or another staff member moving around. But it was different. This sound was deliberate, almost rhythmic, like footsteps echoing in the distance. I froze, listening carefully. The sound was coming from the direction of the old wing, the part of the hospital that hadn't been used in years. The lights in that area had been turned off for months, and the hallway was usually dark and silent. I shrugged it off at first. After all, it could have been anything. Maybe the cleaning staff, maybe the wind moving something around. But I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The noise didn't stop. It grew louder, and I could hear it more clearly now. Someone or something was walking down the corridor. But there was no one there. I stood up and walked toward the noise, my feet hesitant, my breath shallow. I reached the end of the hall where the old wing began. The lights were off, and it was so quiet that I could hear the faint sound of my heartbeat in my ears. The hallway was long, the walls faded with age. The floor creaked under my feet with every step I took. As I turned the corner, the noise stopped. Everything went still. Too still. I stepped back, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt heavier here, almost oppressive, like something was watching me. I had to remind myself that it was just the isolation, the darkness, and maybe my nerves getting the best of me. But then I heard it again. The footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They seemed to be coming from the end of the hallway, from the direction of the old supply room, a place that had been locked for months. I knew for a fact that no one was supposed to be back there. I moved toward the sound, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. The closer I got, the more the footsteps seemed to echo, as though whoever was walking was getting closer, but there was still no one in sight. The temperature in the hallway dropped, and my breath became visible in front of me, a cloud of white in the air. It was so cold. I hadn't noticed how cold it had gotten until now. My eyes darted from side to side, searching for anything that could explain this. I was almost at the supply room door when I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker from the corner of my eye, but when I turned my head fully, I saw a figure standing in the doorway of the supply room. I could just make out the outline of someone, but it was vague, like the shape was blurry, distorted. The figure was tall, thin, and draped in what appeared to be an old hospital gown, its edges frayed and torn. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I wanted to call out to ask if someone was there, but the words wouldn't come. The figure just stood there, silent. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the shadow was gone. The hallway was empty again. No footsteps, no movement, just the silence and the overwhelming cold that seemed to press in on me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a logical reason for what I'd seen. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the storm had affected my nerves, but something in my gut told me that what I had just witnessed wasn't normal. I quickly returned to the nurse's station, my hands shaking as I picked up the phone to call security. As I dialed the number, I noticed something strange. The hospital, usually alive with the constant beeping of machines and the sounds of distant chatter, was eerily silent. I had been hearing footsteps before, hadn't I? Yet now there was nothing, not even the hum of the ventilation system. The phone rang once, twice. The third time it picked up. "Security," a calm voice answered. "I think there's someone in the building," I said, my voice unsteady. "I keep hearing footsteps and there's a shadow. Ma'am, this building has been secured. No one is scheduled to be on this floor except you. Are you sure you're feeling all right?" I hesitated, my mind spinning. Sloth, "Yes, I'm fine. I heard something. Can you send someone up here to check?" There was a pause on the other end. "It's likely just the storm, ma'am. The old building creaks sometimes, especially in bad weather. We'll send someone down to check in a few minutes, but I'm sure it's nothing." I didn't feel reassured, but I hung up anyway, feeling a cold chill in my bones. The hallway seemed even darker now, the shadows stretching longer as the storm continued outside. The lights flickered briefly, then returned to their usual hum. I didn't wait. I couldn't. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my coat and hurried to the stairs, desperate to get out of that building. But just as I reached the door to the stairwell, I heard it again. Faint, distant footsteps, as though someone was walking behind me. I didn't look back. I bolted out of the hospital, into the rain, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I don't know what happened that night. I couldn't explain the shadow or the footsteps or the overwhelming sense of being watched. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back to that hospital. Not alone. Not again. I never returned for another night shift. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The night shift at the old warehouse was usually quiet. I had been working there for just over a month, and by now I had gotten used to the solitude. The building was large, with high ceilings and endless rows of shelves stacked with boxes. Most of the employees worked during the day, but for some reason, the company needed someone to monitor the warehouse at night. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a steady job, and the hours were decent. The only catch was the isolation. The air was always heavy with the smell of dust and the faint scent of old wood, as if the building itself had seen better days. The lights were dim, and the hum of the overhead fluorescent bulbs was constant, a low buzz that filled the silence. I sat at a desk near the entrance, my job mostly consisting of monitoring security cameras and making sure no one broke in. The building was in a pretty secluded area, so the only disturbances I usually had to deal with were the occasional raccoon or stray cat scurrying through the loading dock. But one night, something changed. It was just after 2 a.m., and the building was as still as it ever was. I was scrolling through my phone, killing time when I noticed something odd on the security monitor. One of the cameras, which had a clear view of the back corner of the warehouse, was showing a strange blur of movement. At first, I thought it was just the low-quality camera or maybe a glitch, but the movement didn't stop. It lingered, as though someone or something was moving just out of the camera's view. I stood up and walked over to the monitor, frowning. The back corner was where the older crates were stored, the ones that had been sitting there for years. No one ever went back there. It was practically forgotten. Still, I could see the shape moving around on the screen, and barely visible, but definitely there. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a light was flickering, or the camera had caught something like a hanging string swaying in the air. I tried to convince myself it was just the kind of glitch that happened when cameras got old. But then the figure on the screen took a few steps forward, and I saw it more clearly. It was a shadow, a dark figure that seemed to dart between the crates. The movement was erratic, unnatural. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My heart rate quickened. I knew I was the only person in the building. The night guard was supposed to be alone, and no one had entered the warehouse in hours. I had locked all the doors myself. So, what was that? I grabbed the flashlight from under the desk and slowly walked toward the back of the warehouse. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I couldn't ignore the strange feeling in my gut. The place was silent, except for the faint squeak of my shoes on the concrete floor. The closer I got to the back corner, the heavier the air seemed to feel. My breath became shallow, and my mind raced. I reached the section where the crates were stacked, and there was nothing. No shadow. No figure. Just the same dusty crates I'd seen 1,000 times. I took a few steps deeper into the row of crates, shining my flashlight over the stacks. The light flickered briefly, and I felt the temperature drop, a cold draft rushing past me. I glanced over my shoulder, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something move at the far end of the aisle. I turned quickly, but again, there was nothing. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I had been working alone for too long, and the lack of sleep and the eerie quiet of the warehouse were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Something was wrong. I turned back toward the exit, walking quickly now. As I passed the row of crates, I heard a sound, a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I slowly turned toward the noise, trying to steady my breath. The sound was coming from one of the crates. I slowly moved closer, trying to make out what was causing it. The scraping continued, and I was almost certain it was coming from inside the crate. I didn't know what to think. Who would be hiding in a crate at this time of night? With my hand trembling, I approached the crate. I lifted my flashlight, shining it on the wooden surface, and that's when I saw it. There was a small gap in the corner of the crate, barely large enough to fit a hand through, but enough for something, or someone, to move inside. The scraping stopped as soon as my light hit it, and I held my breath. I didn't know whether to call for help or investigate further. My instincts told me to run, to get out of there, but I felt rooted to the spot. I took a step forward, my hand reaching for the gap in the crate. Just as my fingers brushed the wood, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. There was no one there. I waited, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped. Then, in the stillness, I heard something else. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. Help! I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. The voice seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls of the warehouse. It was distant, but it sounded like it was pleading, like it was trapped somewhere, desperate for help. I felt a surge of panic, and for the first time, I wished I wasn't alone, but there was no one else in the building. I had to face whatever this was on my own. I slowly backed away from the crate, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The voice had stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I could still feel it, the weight of eyes on me, the cold breath of something unseen. I turned toward the exit, moving faster now, desperate to get out of that place. Just as I reached the door to the office, I heard it again, a soft, scraping noise. This time it was coming from directly behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst into the office, slamming the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked the door and backed away from it, panting. The building was silent again. Too silent. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than ever, but it couldn't drown out the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the next hour glued to the security monitor, watching every camera feed, waiting for any sign that there was something or someone else in the building. But the footage was clear. The warehouse was empty. There was no sign of movement. No figures. No shadows. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sun began to rise, and the weight in my chest slowly lifted. By the time the morning shift arrived, I was a nervous wreck, exhausted from lack of sleep and too shaken to work. I had to tell someone, but I didn't know who would believe me. How could I explain the voice, the footsteps, or the scraping noises from the crates? How could I explain the feeling that something had been watching me the entire time? I left the warehouse that morning and never returned. I don't know what I saw or what it was that followed me through the shadows of the building, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never work a night shift alone again. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The hospital had always been a quiet, eerie place at night, but I never thought much about it. I'd worked the night shift as a janitor at Mercy General for almost a year, and I had become accustomed to the stillness, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing down long, empty hallways. It was a routine I had learned to accept, but there were certain nights when it felt like something more than just the usual loneliness crept into the halls. Tonight, however, was different. The night had started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., changed into my uniform, and grabbed my mop and bucket. The building was mostly quiet, with only a few nurses and doctors doing rounds or attending to emergencies. I was assigned to the main floor, where I had to clean the long corridors, mop the waiting areas, and disinfect the public restrooms. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job, and the pay was decent. As I walked through the sterile hallways, the smell of antiseptic filled my nose. The floor beneath me was cold and uninviting. I kept my head down, focusing on the task at hand. The only sounds that accompanied me were the soft swish of the mop as it slid across the floor and the occasional creak of the building's old infrastructure. Around 2 a.m., I was working near the back of the hospital, in a section where the less critical patients were kept. This part of the building had been here for decades and felt different from the rest of the hospital. The walls were cracked, the ceiling tiles yellowed with age, and the overhead lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows along the corridor. I always tried to move quickly through this section, as the silence here was unsettling, even for someone who was used to working in the quiet of the night. As I was scrubbing a particularly stubborn stain on the floor near the nurse's station, I heard a faint sound, something like footsteps, soft but deliberate. I froze, looking up. No one was there. I glanced around, my heart racing for a moment, but I shook my head, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks. The hospital was so empty at night that every sound felt magnified. I went back to my work, but the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, almost right behind me. I spun around quickly, but again, there was no one there. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I walked over to the nurse's station, hoping to find someone who could explain the sounds. As I approached, I saw one of the nurses, Karen, standing near the desk. She was facing the wall, staring intently at something, her hands clutching a clipboard. "Hey, Karen," I called out. She didn't respond. I took another step forward, and my stomach dropped as I noticed her expression. She looked pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth slightly open. It was as if she hadn't heard me at all. "Karen?" I said again, my voice rising in concern. Suddenly, she blinked rapidly and looked at me. Her face softened as she seemed to snap out of her trance. "Sorry, I was just thinking," she said, her voice shaky. "What's up? Did you hear those footsteps just now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen frowned, her gaze shifting to the empty hallway behind me. "What footsteps?" "Never mind," I said, my unease growing. "I must be imagining things." She nodded, but her eyes darted around the hallway nervously, as though she was waiting for something. "I'll be going now," she said quickly before walking away toward the nurse's station. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where Karen had been, a knot tightening in my stomach. There was something off about her behavior. It wasn't like her to be so jittery. I tried to shake off the feeling and return to my cleaning, but the uneasy sensation continued to linger, like a presence just beyond my awareness, always there but never fully visible. I moved down the hallway, glancing at the rooms as I passed. All the doors were closed, and the faint sounds of beeping machines were the only indications that life existed behind those walls. When I reached the far end of the corridor, I noticed a door that was slightly ajar. It was an empty room, and the door should have been shut. Nobody had been assigned to that bed in months. I hesitated for a moment, then walked over to close it. As I pushed the door open further, I felt a wave of cold air hit me. It was strange, there was no reason for the room to feel so cold. The temperature outside was mild, and the air conditioning inside the hospital was usually even and controlled. I stepped inside, looking around. The room was dark, except for a faint glow coming from a machine near the bed. But what caught my attention was the silhouette at the far end of the room. It was a figure, hunched over, sitting at the foot of the bed. At first, I thought it was a person, a patient maybe, but the shape didn't move. It just sat there perfectly still. I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. I took a few steps closer, my eyes fixed on the silhouette. The closer I got, the more wrong it seemed. The figure was too still, too silent. There was an unnatural stillness about it that made my skin crawl. Just as I was about to call out again, the figure suddenly turned its head toward me. Its eyes were dark, hollow, with no pupils. The skin was pale, almost gray, and stretched tightly over its skull, as if it had been lifeless for years. The lips were cracked, twisted into a silent grimace. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure's gaze was locked on mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I had to get out of there. I stumbled backward, bumping into the wall. The figure remained still, its eyes never leaving mine. In that moment, the room seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing in around me. I could hear the faint sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I turned and fled from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I ran down the hallway, not daring to look back. My chest was tight with fear, my breath shallow. I couldn't make sense of what I had just seen. I passed by the nurse's station, but this time I didn't stop. I rushed toward the staff break room, locking myself inside. My hands were shaking and I struggled to steady my breath. What had I just witnessed? I stayed in that break room for the rest of my shift, too terrified to leave. When the morning shift arrived, I tried to act normal, but the look in my eyes must have said everything. I didn't speak to anyone about what happened that night, and I never returned to that part of the hospital again. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel the cold air, and I hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. And I wonder if it was a ghost, or if something darker still lurks in the shadows of Mercy General. Story the end.